It turns out that all roads do, in fact, lead back to that squalid hamlet. After all, it is your birthright. My name is Tom, otherwise known as Titanium Legman, and welcome back to the channel. Hello everyone, if you enjoy what I do, my coverage of the gaming sphere writ large, news, guides, gameplay, etc., a like on this video and a subscription to the channel would be very much appreciated. Thank you so much. We're taking a bit of a break from Unicorn Overlord coverage today as some big news dropped about Darkest Dungeon 2, a game that we covered fairly extensively here on the channel back when it released into its 1.0 version early last year, and which I really want to be able to love. And hopefully, this new update is going to do exactly that. It is called the Kingdoms Update. It was recently announced by Red Hook, and is going to be coming in 2024 for free for all players. What is it? Well, it's not just a rebalancing update, adding new heroes or anything like that. What it actually is a fully new game mode that is more than a little, I would say, reminiscent of the original gameplay style of Darkest Dungeon 1. We haven't seen much of it, just a quick minute 30-second trailer, but it's already looking pretty promising. It drops the carriage gameplay, the sort of road trip aspect that was very controversial in Darkest Dungeon 2, for a more traditional map-based, almost dungeon crawly, but you're more exploring the world rather than a dungeon system where you have a roster to manage, you have different objectives that you need to meet, there's upgrade trees to go down. It feels pretty familiar from what we've seen thus far. Now, interestingly, there was a press release. This information comes from Game Informer, linked to their article in the description below, where a few other bits of information were discussed. As mentioned, Kingdoms will be free for all Darkest Dungeon 2 players on PC. It'll bring in new gameplay mechanics, 3 new monster factions, very notably the Coven, the Beastmen, and most notably, the Crimson Courtiers of the Crimson Court, which is very exciting, very, very iconic enemies for Darkest Dungeon. It can be played independently of the original Confessions campaign mode, which is very interesting. I'm wondering how progression is going to work between the two. And there's actually a statement from creative director Chris Bourassa as well. He says, quote, "Kingdoms is an exciting project for us. If you look at our release history, no game or DLC has ever retread ground, and we're proud to continue that tradition here. This new mode will blend some of the permanence and roster management of the original Darkest Dungeon with the traversal and combat of Darkest Dungeon 2. Best of all, this is a massive free update to Darkest Dungeon 2, packing our flagship title with even more content and value for our players." Apparently, we'll be defending the kingdom, journeying across its lands, gathering resources, all that type of good stuff. And now this is very interesting, right? Because we do know, as Chris says, Red Hook doesn't like to retread ground. Everything that they ever added to Darkest Dungeon 1 was new, it was different. Either a traditional expansion with a whole new faction of enemies with the Crimson Court, or a sort of endless battle mode that you could stack up infinite rewards and fights and enemies with unique trade-ins for the resources that you could earn from the mode with Color of Madness, or the PvP mode of the Butcher's Circus, which absolutely no one expected them to do. Everything in Darkest Dungeon 1 was distinct from one another. Then we move on to Darkest Dungeon 2, and again, for the same reasons, they completely shook up the game. Yeah, it's the same art style, yeah, it's the majority of the same characters, yeah, they function largely how you would expect compared to their original counterparts, but the way combat actually flowed was changed with the addition of tokens to take out a lot of the RNG of the base game. Obviously, dungeon crawling was no longer a thing as you were on this road trip down a path that gave you a couple branching paths a la Slay the Spire, but that was a pretty linear experience. It was also made into a roguelite instead of a single sprawling campaign. And a lot of these changes were things that people didn't very much appreciate, myself included. Now, I mentioned that we did cover the game fairly extensively back when it came out, but I never actually finished it, and it's largely because I just bounced off of the changes that Red Hook made to Darkest Dungeon 2 compared to Darkest Dungeon 1. I have struggled to fully resonate with the roguelite nature of the game, the impermanence of the roster, the fairly linear traversal paths, the lack of real exploration, etc., etc. I am not the biggest roguelite fan around. I do enjoy them occasionally, but it's not something that I tend to stick with very long, and I think it's because that lack of permanence means that, in my mind, nothing really matters. Even in a roguelite where you do have meta progression, you're continuing to unlock different things, stuff that was added to Darkest Dungeon 2, I want to get invested in my characters, in my campaign, in the world, And losing a run and just starting over again and going back through the same things, maybe just in a shuffled up pattern and potentially unlocking a couple new things along the way, just doesn't do it for me the way just sitting down and grinding through a grueling campaign does. That's why I fell in love with Darkest Dungeon 1 in the first place, was you have this huge campaign with a massive roster of characters that you could potentially lose forever, but some of them you'll be able to bring through all the way to the Darkest Dungeon itself, and building that story, making those memories with those characters, the way you progress through the campaign, your successes and your failures. That was the epitome of Darkest Dungeon for me. And it's, I mean, pretty indicative of the game's design in general. It's kind of what they want you to do. Dealing with the stress mechanic, overcoming it, pushing through, making broken, wounded, battered, but still heroes out of these mixed bag of ne'er-do-wells. It's part of the fun, part of the charm, and you lose a lot of that, in my opinion, in the transition to Darkest Dungeon 2. Also, meta progression for me just doesn't feel the same as proper progression. There's something to be said for unlocking a new tier of weapon upgrades and getting your favorite heroes that next set of stat boosts, or being able to find a new type of skill that you can teach someone that is now permanently a part of their roster that you can start building teams around. Hell, just building out an ever-expanding roster with different potential team comps within it that you can swap around and take on different missions to do different things. I love that, and you don't really get that much in Darkest Dungeon 2. There's ways that they try to accommodate it, but it's not there. It's not the same. So, I'm very, very curious about this Kingdoms update. Again, from what we've seen, there is a fair bit of Darkest Dungeon 1 feeling to it. There's inns to travel to, there's different sections of the world map to traverse through. It seems like there almost might be, kind of in a similar way to the way that Darkest Dungeon 2 works in its base form in the Confessions mode, a sort of random conglomeration of different biomes, different types of areas that you'll progress between on your way to different objectives as you move around the map. We can see in the screenshots here or in the footage from the trailer, the fetter, the mountain, the sprawl, etc., scattered around between inns, campfires, and the like. So presumably, you're going to get tasks of trying to get to a certain area, or find a particular type of item, or clear a particular type of enemy, things like that. And how you get to what that objective is will determine what types of fights you're taking, what types of enemies you're encountering, and potentially how many opportunities to rest, recover, and power up along the way you can find. And that's awesome, because again, that's, if you look at the maps in any given dungeon in Darkest Dungeon 1, that's exactly how it works there as well. We can also see that we have a full roster of heroes up at the top of the bar. Presumably, all of the heroes that are currently in the game will be part of this. Maybe we'll see other heroes coming in as well with this update, but seeing as how the last drop of 2 heroes, including the Crusader, was paid DLC, I would be surprised if this was added for free. They might put a hero in here for free as incentive to get people playing, because I get the feeling not many people are playing Darkest Dungeon 2 right now, unfortunately. So we'll see. That might be something that happens as well, but I'm curious how you're actually going to be able to swap your characters around between fights. Are you only going to be able to set up a team when you're, say, at an inn, or are you going to actually be able to go into an area and say, what heroes do you want to take into this fight with you? Because that would be awesome. One of the issues that I've always had with the Darkest Dungeon 2 combat system is, unlike when you go into a dungeon in DD1, where there's some variance with neutral, generic types of enemies that can show up all over the place, otherwise you know what you're facing, right? You go into the Cove, you know you're going to be fighting fishmen, you're going to be fighting things that have high bleed resistance, maybe lower blight resistance, things that are going to cause a lot of bleed on you, etc., and you can build out your team to accommodate that. In Darkest Dungeon 2, you never really know what areas, what biomes are going to be presented for you to choose between, and if you wind up in a situation where you just have an unfavorable matchup no matter which path you take based off of the heroes that you chose for the trip, it kind of sucks, man, and it can shoot a run in the foot before you even really get it going, or maybe before you even have a chance to really try and take on a boss that you built that team to take on. In DD1, you didn't really have to worry about that as much, and that was part of the charm for it, was actually learning what each area demanded, what was efficient and effective where, and then building your team out to accommodate that. I'm hoping that in the Kingdom mode, a little bit of that comes back as well. So you can say, oh, we're going to be going into the Sprawl. Let me pack my Plague Doctor for burn healing. Let me not bring the Runaway, since she specializes in burns. Enemies are going to be resistant to that type of thing. I'll bring the Leper, because he doesn't really care if he gets blinded. He can remove his own blinds from the smoke attacks from enemies, etc. Having that tactical decision-making brought back in a meaningful way would be huge. I'm also very curious to see what type of skill tree progression there is, what unlocks you get in that regard. That's not something that was really a thing in DD1, but it does, in function, remind me a little bit of the weapon and skill upgrades that you could get as you progress through the game. So I'm hoping that that is going to be similar in a fashion. How exactly it's going to work remains to be seen. But all in all, I'm extremely pleased to hear about this update. I'm guessing it'll probably be out in the latter end of fall, the beginning of winter, based off of when they've announced it now, at the beginning of spring. Probably going to be a little while yet before it's going to be out. If it was going to be a closer release date, they would have just announced that, I would imagine. So I'm guessing towards the end of the year. But when this does drop, I am absolutely going to be checking it out on the channel. I may also try to get some more live streams in of the Confessions mode, maybe try to finally finish that. I have wanted to get the DLC for the Crusader. I have wanted to try and beat the third boss that we were stuck on now that it's been changed to be far less obnoxious to try to deal with. And I think, I don't know, I get the feeling based off of the vibe of the trailer that the Kingdoms mode technically takes place after the story of the Confessions mode. And I am curious about the story in that, so I don't want to be spoiled. So maybe we'll do that. But yeah, I'm very excited about this. Props to Red Hook for putting together a big update like this that hopefully is going to be more appealing to old school fans like myself that never quite properly fully gelled with the original design of DD2. Absolutely wish them the best. I love these devs. They do a ton of cool stuff, and I hope that we're able to sink our teeth into this when it drops in presumably the end of the year. Let me know what your thoughts are of all of this. Are you excited? Are you going to be playing Kingdoms? Are you happy with the way DD2 has gone? Are you maybe less happy about it the way I am? Let me know all that down in the comments below. And if you would be excited to see more Darkest Dungeon on the channel once again, let me know that too. With that said, though, I'm going to wrap this one up here. My name has been Tom, otherwise known as Titanium Legman. I hope you all have a good night. Stay safe and healthy out there. And remember, be good to each other. Bye now.